Welcome to this Information Services Today webinar on managing personnel and change. This webinar addresses content from Part 4, Managing Information Organizations, specifically focusing on chapters 20 and 22. This webinar is part of a 10-webinar series representing the diverse authors and topics of the second edition of my book, Information Services Today, an Introduction. As the editor, I am thrilled to be presenting this webinar series in conjunction with my textbook, Information Services Today, an Introduction. Hearing directly from the contributing authors as they reflect and share their insight on today's information landscape is a unique opportunity to glean from their expertise, both the opportunities and challenges that lie on the horizon. Stephen Bell recently said, "It helps leaders to harness their own creative potential, but they should also pay attention to creating the right culture and environment that lead to a creative library organization as a whole." Part 4 introduces readers to a range of management roles, from developing a strategic plan to design thinking, from collection management to managing the technological landscape of the information organization. But Part 4 goes beyond these organizational roles to also look at how to manage the rapidly changing information organization. This section provides guidance on how to foster innovation and strategic planning to make the information organization continually relevant to its community. The section also has a dedicated focus on the management skills and competencies needed of today's information professionals to meet today's challenges. Chapter 20 provides a look at the skills needed for change management, including a selection of case studies to demonstrate just how those skills can be applied in information organizations. Chapter 22 discusses key principles for managing personnel and specifically addresses important considerations related to hiring, onboarding, and both progressive and positive discipline. Of tremendous value to this book are its contributing authors. These authors were specifically chosen for their expertise, passion, and commitment, not only to the field of information science, but also to the professional development of tomorrow's information leaders. I would now like to introduce the panel of authors for this webinar. Ruth Barefoot is a lecturer for the School of Information at San Jose State University, teaching change management and issues in public libraries. She also consults for www.barefootlibraries.com. Ruth is the author of Chapter 20 on change management. Bruce L. Haller is the Associate Dean and Director of Graduate Business Programs at Molloy College, Rockville Center, New York. Haller has practiced law for over 20 years, specializing in the areas of employment and contract law. Haller is the co-author of Chapter 22, Managing Personnel. The other authors of this chapter include Robert Gotch, Don DiStefano, and Maureen McKenzie. There are 6 key themes for the second edition of Information Services Today, an Introduction. Chapters 20 and 22 each address 2 of these key themes. Their chapters address how libraries and information centers will remain valuable entities in their communities, but to thrive, they will need to remain creative, innovative, and technologically advanced. These chapters also address new competencies, roles, and opportunities for information professionals. Ruth and Bruce, what are your interpretation of these themes and how do they specifically relate to your chapter's content? Ruth, let's begin with you.
Thank you, Sandra, or Sandy. I believe that libraries and information centers and all of the professionals that work in them, they're moving so quickly with technological changes, with resource changes that are, there's more collaborative components and partnerships embedded in how we deliver services now, so that we do have to kind of change with the times and be able to have those skills ready and waiting for those assignments that inevitably come onto our plates. So I think with the civic engagement and the platforms that are necessary, especially in public libraries, as well as other library types and information center types in our communities. Change is often happening there. And we need to create environments that are very safe and inclusive, that try and encourage everyone to come to the table. And in libraries, because of the very neutrality in the core of who they are, sort of foster that better than a lot of other entities in our communities. So I believe that that is how we need to kind of take a look at that, how change is being fostered through our facilities, through our libraries, through our online communities that library personnel and information professionals are promoting and making available.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And Bruce, what are your thoughts?
Well, I support and agree with what Ruth was talking about in terms of the change and the preparation necessary when you're going to consider recruiting personnel to work in these information centers. If we realize that we need new skills and changing skills, it's very important that we look to recruit and reach out to diverse groups and be inclusive when we look to hire these groups to work in these information centers so they are representative of the population at large. And we are focused on, from a legal standpoint and a managerial standpoint, updating our job descriptions and our recruiting efforts to make sure that these information centers not only in a neutral fashion bring in candidates, but also train, motivate, and manage these candidates effectively.
Thank you, Bruce. And I'd like to open it up to both of you if there are other questions or comments or observations you'd like. It does seem like change is a really core component of our field, and so it's great that to have Ruth addressing that, and certainly our personnel need to be able to be up to speed and be ready to embrace some of that change. Do you guys have any other things you'd like to add?
Just echoing what Bruce is saying too, at the interviewing process, the questions have changed. The individuals that we're seeing on the other side of the interview desk has really changed. But we also have to foster a climate, this environment, and we'll probably get into that too, where the people doing the hiring can imagine a really great lineup of folks that they are hiring and to plug them in appropriately. And I hope we can talk more about that as the questions come up.
Great. Bruce, did you have anything else that you wanted to say?
In the interview process, considering how our climate has changed both socially and politically over the last few years, it's become even more important that we are not only inclusive in the process, but we are assertive about going and finding diverse groups of people to be able to contribute to this process, and then to make sure that the senior people in the information centers that have moved up to the point of doing the hiring are kept up to speed in what questions to ask, what questions can't they ask. The first thing that comes to mind to me is, the use of social media in some of the recruiting and some of the information culling parts of onboarding.
Great. Well, thank you both. Well, there may be some things that we'll be able to circle back to as we move through the rest of the webinar. So let's now direct our attention to today's information landscape. The first edition of this book came out 3 years ago. And as you know, the field of library and information science is in constant flux, as we've been talking about. What are some of the key changes as they relate to your chapter's topic that have occurred since the first edition came out 3 years ago? Ruth, why don't we start with you?
Okay, thank you, Sandy. I I wasn't in the first or the edition, the last edition. So I think it's very important that now we've formalized the understanding that change managers, change leaders, the tool that they bring to organizations is quite necessary in how library organizations, information centers move forward. It's now an essential skill, and people that are doing the hiring are looking for these folks that can lead projects right from the point of hiring. They are dealing with change immediately. So knowing how to have those conversations, knowing how to wrap your head around some of the change that's happening, understanding the key trends out there, and that's all so important. So I think that now we expect and we've formalized the need to have individuals that have this skill, have different tools in their tool belt to help foster change, to help foster an environment where change can happen. It may not be just them, they may be assisting someone higher up. So it's all it's such an interesting time to be in. Change happens very quickly, and we need staff that will be equipped to handle it and to help lead it.
Thank you, Ruth.
You bet.
Bruce, what are some of your thoughts?
While it certainly existed 3 years ago, the increased use of recruiting personnel and candidates through uh, LinkedIn Jobs app and Facebook and using social media sites, whether it's uh, Indeed or Glassdoor, to create your applicant pool is creates problems and issues that the information manager has to be aware of in terms of accessibility. You know, what are the demographics of the people that are on these sites that you're recruiting out to? Uh, who, if you're looking to increase inclusion in who you're bringing into that applicant pool, you have to be aware of who is on these sites and what kind of candidates you're getting. Once you get the uh, the employee into your organization, starting to use whether it's the internet or intranet to do evaluations of employees and to communicate, I think is something that we have to be aware of because people communicate differently when they're not sitting across a desk face to face. And these raise additional management, motivation, and legal challenges that we have to be aware of.
Thank you, Bruce. So, again, I'd like to get your responses or your thoughts or any questions that you'd like to raise in response to this last um, set of discussions. Anything you'd like to observe or comment on? Okay. Well, then let's keep going to the next one. So now let's direct our attention to the future. What trends and or emerging issues will impact the field of library and information science as it relates to your chapter's content? So again, Ruth, we'll start with you.
Okay, so what I have seen is that we're starting to see organizations providing not only a very visible, tangible appreciation for change, that change is an essential component, that they're now communicating that across the organization, that they're having more, they're fostering a climate where the executive staff, the managerial, the supervision, they all have to be not on the same page so much as in the process and helping at the table, and so they are all appreciating the need for change and the hard work that goes into it. I think too, you find more um, appreciation for how hard it is to help individuals within the staff makeup. And Bruce can talk about this as well, that some embrace it so much more readily, depending on different skills and personality and characteristics in their career, and opportunities that they might have had, but some kind of shut it down. So I think it's quite interesting how librarians and information specialists are coming through, getting trained on how to help the individual versus they make something and push out the project and it's just adopted. Though those days are not necessarily here anymore. And so we do have to have conversations sometimes one at a time.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, Bruce, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Ruth makes an excellent point about as technology changes, the job description and the job duties change to a great degree. And that might mean that we're looking for different skills, different characteristics, different personalities in the information center specialist who actually is going to be doing this work. We see changes from brick and mortar libraries and brick and mortar bookstores and online colleges. And now we're hiring people that need to have a different skill set and the ability to measure whether people have that skill set, the ability to find people that have that skill set. And then once you employ them, the ability to motivate them, manage them, and evaluate them changes to a great degree. And I think we need to make sure that we input procedures and policies that can effectively evaluate and can effectively measure whether these people are doing the job that we're asking them to do, a different job than maybe we asked them to do certainly 5 and 10 years ago, but maybe as recently as 3 and 4 years ago.
Thank you, Bruce. Did you guys have anything that you'd like to discuss on this topic? I think you've made some really important points.
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to add was, the laws that address the issue of, for example, hours of work or
Mhm.
overtime or minimum wage or things within the Fair Labor Standards Act and with some of the minimum wage laws that are out there. How do you measure uh, when a person's working, how much they're working, their productivity? I think we have to change or look at how some of these laws have changed uh, over the years and make sure they're adapting to what's really being asked of workers to do.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, for years, I personally worked with in virtual team environments. Not to mention currently, but even when I worked in industry, I worked in virtual team environments. So how do you know how people's productivity, and how do you assess that, and what makes for happy employees, and how do you motivate people, and what makes for efficient work styles? And so there's a lot of variables to consider. Ruth, did you want to add anything?
I do. I do think that things are there. There's a lot of lines that are being blurred, and it's so important that instructors, for sure, understand this, but also the students that are learning from these chapters, that they look at each other's, the colleagues, the other students, and understand that these are the new workers in the field, and that everybody thinks differently. So when we have those discussions in our own classes, that we understand that it is a precursor to, as they get into their being hired in a particular position and job, that they understand the different tools that they need are being almost practiced and honed right there in classes that they're taking for this master's degree. It's so important that they understand how lines are blurring, um, the different of when they work, where they work, how they work. It's not just a matter of people's personalities or characteristics or skills. It's just so interesting how technology has now, I think, changed and tweaked a bit of how we are effective in our organizations.
Thank you so much. That's been a really good discussion. So let's, now that we've addressed the changes of the past few years and the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead, but really at the core of the information landscape are the people who work in these organizations, much as we've been talking about, because they're the ones that are providing services to the communities that they serve. So that leads us to our focus on today's information professional. So what advice do you have for the new information professional to meet the needs of tomorrow's information landscape? And based on your area of expertise, what are some of the key competencies that information professionals will need to succeed in meeting the needs of the communities and organizations that they serve? So, Ruth, we'll start with you.
Um, as I've been kind of chatting, this word toolkit is such an important component, and I think we need to wrap our heads around the different skills that sometimes we take for granted, like really having a great vision as to what you want. When you work in a library or an information center, your professional vocabulary is an important piece. How you communicate, how often you communicate. In some ways, you want to understand the fact that you can't even over communicate. A lot of us think that since we sent out the email, that should have been enough. Why are you having a problem with this? Well, there are different people that communicate differently, and so we need to be very cognizant of that and to allow for that conversation to happen. Another piece is not just vision, but then and how to communicate that vision, but then how to create and foster an environment where people feel comfortable coming to the table, where their ideas and their input is valuable. And we're working towards this common goal. So these are all components to how change can happen. Another piece is that I teach my students is how important trust is. And trust, this is such a big thing in our society. But also in our organizations, and especially as you get these organizations to go from into partnerships, these natural collaborative environments, whether it's an environment inclusive within the larger organization, or even outside of that. So trust is a big one, and I think you're going to be able to get more out of the change process and be ready for the next change challenge.
Thank you, Ruth. And Bruce, what are your thoughts?
I think as technology changes, we sometimes look at a difference between technology natives and technology immigrants. My daughters and students are, in their 20s, and they've grown up with the smartphone in their hand. And I think sometimes they take for granted what the power they have with the technology, and yet at the same time aren't appreciating the difference between speaking on a Skype or speaking in a GoToMeeting or a FaceTime and speaking physically in the same room. There's a difference, and I believe we have to make sure that the information technology professional is aware of those differences, and yet continues to master the ability to use the technology as it's changing to accomplish their objectives, whether that's communicating with clients, students, other information specialists. There's just a difference. I find that students are much more comfortable texting me something than they would say to me if they were sitting on the other side of my desk talking to me. And I think that's just one small example of we have to master the technology, but be aware of its differences and then be prepared to train, motivate, and utilize people to use those differences.
Thank you, Bruce. I'd like to open it up now to any kind of comments that you'd like to make on this topic. I had a question while you guys are thinking. So, Ruth, I wanted to ask you a follow up on your comment. You said that how important it is to develop trust, and what are some of the ways that people can go about that in today's kind of information environments that people are working? What are some strategies or approaches they might use?
Right. I think it's so interesting how possibly a negative environment in their past may color the way that they look at every single organization and job in any one of these organizations that they might work in now has changed the way they communicate, the way that they appreciate a colleague or are willing to work with a supervisor. So what I think communication, you want to definitely understand what somebody else is saying, and work to do that. So active listening is a big part of that, to really take in the information before you kind of get biographical. Well, it's about me in the way you're sharing that information. So I think we need to be conscientious of that. Another piece that I see repeated in a lot of students that I work with is the fact that they feel that they don't have the power to say, what I heard is something totally different. Let's go to the source and find out what's actually the case. They don't feel like they have the chance to do that. They feel like it's a one-way piece, where they have to just kind of take whatever. And maybe Bruce is going to talk about that. But I thought it was just fascinating to understand that, and to have people sort of own up the fact that it starts with them to be accountable right then in every single conversation.
Great, thank you. Bruce, did you have anything you wanted to respond?
Yeah, the two things that I thought of were the differences in the abilities that the information professional has to be aware of. I deal with a lot of very successful business people, accountants, Wall Street people, C-suite people, and their understanding of the technology that's out there and available to them is just such a broad continuum. I think if the information professional understands that because this person sitting across the desk from them seeking information is successful in business, it doesn't mean they aren't a complete novice in gathering information or being able to utilize information. And just to address the trust piece from a little bit of a different angle, I find that my students and my clients don't often know the difference between what's out there that they can trust or not, whether it's the reliability of websites, or whether it's, because it's in a blog or because it's on a website, then that gives it more credibility than maybe, than an information professional would know that it really should have.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'd like to now thank Ruth Barefoot and Bruce Holler for joining us today in this webinar on managing personnel and change. I'm so grateful and honored for the insights and advice that you've shared in this webinar, and also for your contribution to information services today in introduction. To the listener, thank you for joining us. I hope you gained a deeper understanding of the changes, challenges, and opportunities within the field of library and information science. For more information, please check out the supplementary materials that are available to you via the online supplements, and thank you again.